I'm Jessica Martinez, 32 years old, and the moment my sister Melissa tearfully announced she was carrying my husband's baby, I knew she was lying. Not because I trusted David completely, but because I'd been tracking her bank statements for months and saw the payments to that sketchy clinic in East Austin where she'd been buying fake medical documents. What Melissa didn't know was that every dollar she'd been spending on her elaborate deception came from accounts I controlled. She had no idea that the sister she was trying to destroy actually owned her entire life. When she looked me in the eyes that humid August evening and whispered that she was sorry but she loved David and couldn't help what had happened, I smiled and told her I forgave her. That smile should have been her first warning. Because while she was busy planning how to steal my husband, I was planning how to take absolutely everything she'd ever valued, including the family who'd always chosen her over me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of how I discovered my sister's ultimate betrayal begins 3 years earlier, on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. David and I had just returned from our honeymoon in Costa Rica, sun-kissed and completely in love, when we walked into my parents' backyard barbecue to celebrate our marriage. The whole extended family was there, cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts and uncles gathering around picnic tables laden with my mom's famous carnitas and homemade salsa. But the moment we stepped through the gate, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with familiar disappointment. Every single person was clustered around Melissa, who was dramatically recounting some story that had everyone laughing and hanging on her every word. When David and I approached, the attention shifted to us for exactly 30 seconds before Melissa launched into an elaborate tale about her latest dating disaster, complete with voices and gestures that had everyone doubled over with laughter. This was the pattern I'd grown up with. Melissa could walk into any room and become the center of attention within minutes, while I faded into the background despite whatever achievements I'd recently accomplished. It didn't matter that I'd just graduated summa cum laude from UT Austin with a computer science degree, or that the app I'd been developing in my spare time was already generating serious interest from major tech companies. When Melissa was around, I became invisible, and she seemed to thrive on that dynamic. What made it worse was that she wasn't even trying to upstage me. The attention just flowed to her naturally, like water finding the lowest point, and she'd learned to bask in it without ever questioning whether it was fair or kind to anyone else. David, sweet and oblivious as always, didn't understand the family dynamics he'd married into. He kept trying to steer conversations back to our honeymoon, or our plans for fixing up the house we'd bought in Westlake Hills, but every topic somehow circled back to Melissa's latest adventure or crisis. When she mentioned that her lease was up and she was stressed about finding a new place she could afford on her boutique salary, I watched my parents immediately jump into problem-solving mode, offering to help with deposits and suggesting she move back home temporarily. Nobody mentioned that I'd been paying my own rent since I was 18, or that David and I had just taken on a massive mortgage without asking for family assistance. The inequity was so familiar it barely stung anymore, but I caught David's confused expression and realized he was seeing my family clearly for the first time. Later that night, as we drove home through the winding roads of the hill country, David finally brought up what we were both thinking. "Your sister is really something," he said carefully, and I could hear him choosing his words to avoid sounding critical. "She's very magnetic, but did you notice how every conversation somehow became about her?" I had noticed, of course. I'd been noticing for 28 years. What surprised me was that David had picked up on it so quickly. Most people were charmed by Melissa's personality and never looked deeper to see the subtle ways she manipulated attention and sympathy. "That's just how she is," I said, falling back on the explanation I'd been using my whole life. "She doesn't mean anything by it, she's just naturally charismatic." But even as I defended her, I was remembering the way she'd looked at David throughout the evening. The lingering eye contact during conversations, the way she'd touched his arm when she laughed at his jokes, the slightly too long hug she'd given him when we were leaving. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Melissa was just being her usual flirtatious self with everyone. She'd always been that way, even as a teenager, using her charm to get what she wanted from teachers, store clerks, and especially boys. It was harmless, I convinced myself. Just her personality. What I didn't know at the time was that Melissa had already decided she wanted David for herself. Years later, when I finally read through all her text messages and emails, I discovered that she'd started researching him the moment I brought him home for Christmas dinner the year before we got engaged. She'd looked up his architecture firm, stalked his social media profiles, and even driven by his office building to get a sense of how successful he was. She'd told her friend Brianna that she couldn't understand what David saw in boring Jessica when he could have someone fun and exciting like her. She'd convinced herself that David was only with me because I was stable and safe, not because he actually loved me. The first real warning sign came about 6 months after our wedding, during one of our regular family dinners at my parents' house. Melissa had been unusually quiet during the meal, picking at her food and claiming she wasn't feeling well. When my mom asked if she needed to see a doctor, Melissa waved her off and said it was probably just stress from work and the dating scene. But I noticed the way she kept glancing at David during this conversation, and how she made sure to mention that she'd been feeling nauseous in the mornings and having weird food cravings. At the time I thought she might actually be pregnant and was being coy about revealing it, but something about her performance felt rehearsed, like she was testing out a story to see how people would react. After dinner, while I was helping my mom with the dishes, Melissa cornered David on the back porch under the pretense of asking for advice about a guy she'd been seeing. Through the kitchen window, I watched her lean in close to him, her hand resting on his chest as she spoke in hushed, intimate tones. She was wearing a low-cut top that she kept adjusting, and her body language was unmistakably seductive. David, to his credit, kept stepping back and maintaining appropriate distance, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. When I joined them outside, Melissa immediately straightened up and switched to talking about work drama, as if nothing inappropriate had been happening. That night, I confronted David about the interaction, trying to keep my voice light and casual. Melissa seemed pretty upset about whatever guy she's dating, I said, fishing for his perspective on what had really happened. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with how much to tell me. She wasn't really
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
talking about dating, he finally admitted. She was asking if I thought she was attractive, and whether I ever wondered what it would be like if we'd met first, before you and I got together. I told her that wasn't appropriate and tried to change the subject, but she kept pushing it. My heart sank as the pieces clicked into place. Melissa wasn't just being flirtatious for attention, she was actively trying to seduce my husband. I should have confronted her immediately, but I made the mistake of hoping it was just a temporary infatuation that would fade on its own. Melissa had always been impulsive and dramatic about her crushes, falling hard and fast before moving on to the next exciting thing. I convinced myself that if I ignored it and kept David away from situations where they'd be alone together, she'd eventually lose interest and find someone else to focus on. It was naive and wishful thinking, but I wasn't ready to blow up my family over what might have been just a harmless crush, even though David's account made it clear that Melissa's intentions were far from innocent. Instead of addressing the issue directly, I started paying closer attention to Melissa's behavior and finances, partly out of concern and partly out of suspicion. What I discovered shocked me more than her inappropriate interest in David. My sister, who barely worked 20 hours a week at an overpriced boutique in East Austin, was living a lifestyle that should have been impossible on her income. She drove a nearly new BMW, lived in a trendy loft that rented for $3,000 a month, wore designer clothes, and went out to expensive restaurants several times a week. When I asked her how she could afford all of this, she gave vague answers about winning contests, getting lucky with online giveaways, and receiving help from guys she dated. The contest explanation particularly bothered me, because I'd never known Melissa to enter contests or sweepstakes. She was too disorganized and impulsive to fill out entry forms, or follow the kinds of detailed rules that legitimate contests required. But when I pressed her for specifics, she'd change the subject or create some dramatic distraction that made me feel guilty for questioning her good fortune. It was classic Melissa behavior: deflect, distract, and make the other person feel bad for asking reasonable questions. My suspicions deepened when I noticed that our parents' financial situation had dramatically improved around the same time that Melissa's lifestyle became more extravagant. For years my dad had been stressed about the mortgage on their house in South Austin, a modest ranch-style home they'd bought when I was in high school. He'd been working overtime at the auto repair shop just to make the monthly payments, and my mom had taken on extra bookkeeping clients to help cover the bills. But suddenly, they were talking about renovating the kitchen and taking a vacation to visit relatives in Mexico. When I asked how they'd managed to turn their finances around so quickly, they explained that they'd qualified for some kind of government refinancing program that had reduced their mortgage payment by half. The timing seemed too convenient, and the explanation too vague. I'd studied finance as part of my computer science program, and I knew that mortgage refinancing programs didn't typically offer such dramatic reductions without significant changes to the loan terms or the borrower's financial situation. My parents' income hadn't increased, and their credit score had actually gotten worse during my dad's period of unemployment the previous year. Something about their story didn't add up, but like with Melissa's sudden wealth, I let myself be convinced that they'd just gotten incredibly lucky with some program I wasn't familiar with. What I didn't realize at the time was that both situations were connected, and that someone in my family had been orchestrating financial miracles behind the scenes. The truth was so far from what I imagined that it took me nearly 2 years to piece together what was really happening. During those 2 years, Melissa's pursuit of David became increasingly bold and desperate, while her lifestyle became even more lavish and unsustainable. She started showing up at our house unannounced, always with some excuse about needing to borrow something or wanting to spend time with her favorite sister. She'd time these visits for when she knew David would be home from work, and she'd dress provocatively and find reasons to stay for dinner or hang around until late in the evening. David started working later at his architecture firm, just to avoid these uncomfortable encounters, but Melissa adapted by finding new ways to insert herself into our lives. She volunteered to help with dinner parties, offered to run errands for us, and even suggested that we all take a vacation together so she could get to know David better as a brother-in-law. Each suggestion was presented with such apparent innocence and family spirit that refusing would have made me look paranoid and controlling. But I could see through her act, and more importantly, I could see that David was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with her attention. The situation reached a tipping point during our second wedding anniversary dinner. David had made reservations at a romantic restaurant downtown, and we were looking forward to a quiet evening together to celebrate and talk about our future plans. We'd been trying to get pregnant for several months, and I was hoping the relaxed atmosphere would give us a chance to discuss whether we wanted to see a fertility specialist or just keep trying naturally. But as we were finishing our appetizers, Melissa appeared at our table, claiming she'd been at the bar with friends and had spotted us across the restaurant. She was clearly drunk, and her usual filter between thoughts and words had completely disappeared. She slid into the booth next to David, pressing close against him and slurring compliments about how handsome he looked and how lucky I was to have such an amazing husband. When David tried to politely extract himself from the situation, she grabbed his hand and held it against her chest, telling him that she'd always wished she could find a man exactly like him. The entire scene was mortifying, and other diners were starting to stare at our table. David finally managed to flag down a waiter and arranged for Melissa to be taken home in a taxi, but the damage to our anniversary celebration was done. On the drive home, David and I finally had the conversation we should have had months earlier. "This has to stop, Jess," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Your sister is actively trying to sabotage our marriage, and I can't keep pretending it's just harmless flirtation. Tonight she told me that you don't appreciate me the way she would, and that she knows I must be unhappy because you're too focused on work to be a good wife. She's trying to plant seeds of doubt and create problems between us." I felt sick listening to this, both because of what Melissa had said, and because I realized how much David had been protecting me from her worst behavior. That conversation changed everything between us, but not in the way I expected. Instead of bringing us closer together by acknowledging the threat Melissa posed, it created a new tension in our marriage. David started questioning whether my loyalty to my family was stronger than my commitment to our relationship, while I felt caught between protecting my husband and maintaining peace with my sister and parents. We both agreed that we needed to establish stronger boundaries with Melissa, but we disagreed about how direct and confrontational those boundaries should be. David wanted me to tell her explicitly that her behavior was inappropriate, and that she needed to back off completely. I was terrified that such a direct confrontation would create irreparable damage to my family relationships and turn everyone against me. While we were struggling with this impossible situation, I made a discovery that changed my entire understanding of my family's dynamics and my place within them. I'd been having trouble sleeping due to the stress of dealing with Melissa, and I'd gotten into the habit of working late into the night on a new app project that was helping me process my anxiety. During one of these late-night coding sessions, I decided to take a break and check my email, where I found a message from a venture capital firm expressing serious interest in acquiring the project management app I'd been developing as a side business while working my day job at a tech startup. The initial offer was so much higher than I'd expected that I thought it might be a scam. But after several weeks of negotiations and due diligence, I realized that my little side project had the potential to make me independently wealthy. The app, which I'd called Connect Flow, solved a problem that major corporations were desperately trying to address, and the bidding war between potential buyers quickly escalated beyond my wildest dreams. Within 3 months, I'd sold Connect Flow to Microsoft for $8 million, transforming me from a comfortable middle-class software engineer into someone with genuine financial power. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. Just as my marriage was being threatened by my sister's manipulation and my family relationships were becoming increasingly strained, I suddenly had the resources to completely change the dynamic between all of us. For the first time in my life, I had something that Melissa couldn't charm her way into getting, and I had the power to help or hurt my family in ways that went far beyond emotional support or sibling rivalry. The question was what I was going to do with that power, and whether I could use it to save my marriage and restore some balance to my family relationship. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator to look into my family's finances, not because I suspected them of wrongdoing, but because I wanted to understand exactly how precarious their situations were before I decided how to help them. What the investigator discovered was so shocking that I initially refused to believe it. According to his research, someone had been secretly supporting both Melissa and my parents for nearly 3 years, using a complex network of shell companies and fake assistance programs to funnel money to them without revealing the source. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in rent payments, car loans, credit card bills, and mortgage assistance. At first I assumed that Melissa had found some wealthy benefactor, possibly an older man she was manipulating for financial support. It would have explained her sudden wealth and her confidence in pursuing David, despite having no apparent means to compete with our stable marriage and middle-class lifestyle. But as the investigator dug deeper into the paper trail, a different picture emerged. The shell companies all traced back to a single source, and that source was someone I never would have suspected in a million years. The person who had been secretly funding my entire family's improved lifestyle was someone who had apparently made a fortune and decided to share it anonymously, someone who cared enough about all of us to provide for our needs without seeking credit or recognition. The revelation of this mysterious benefactor's identity would completely upend everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and my own place in the complex web of relationships that had shaped my entire adult life. But before I could process the implications of what I'd learned, Melissa's campaign to steal David escalated to a level that crossed every possible line and forced me to take action that would change all of our lives forever. The investigation results sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to read them completely. When I finally did, the truth was so much worse than anything I could have imagined. The mysterious benefactor who had been secretly supporting my family wasn't some wealthy stranger or sugar daddy that Melissa had manipulated. It was someone much closer to home, someone whose generosity had been twisted into a weapon that was now being used to destroy my marriage. The person funding my sister's designer lifestyle and my parents' financial recovery was my own husband David. According to the financial records my investigator had uncovered, David had been systematically transferring money from his architecture firm's accounts into various shell companies and charitable foundations that he'd created specifically to help my family without them knowing the source. He'd been doing this for over 2 years, starting just a few months after our wedding, when he'd apparently decided that my family needed more help than they were willing to ask for or accept directly. The amounts were staggering when added up over time. He'd paid off my parents' mortgage entirely, not just reduced the payments. He'd been covering Melissa's rent, car payments, credit cards, and shopping expenses to the tune of nearly $10,000 a month. He'd even set up fake contest winnings and sweepstakes prizes to explain away her sudden wealth. The discovery hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My husband, the man I'd trusted completely, had been lying to me about money for years, while my sister used his generosity to fund her campaign to steal him away from me. The betrayal felt layered and complex in ways that made my head spin. David had been dishonest with me about our finances, but his motivations seemed genuinely kind. He'd wanted to help my family without embarrassing them or making them feel indebted to us. But Melissa had been taking his money while simultaneously trying to seduce him, which suggested either breathtaking audacity or a level of compartmentalization that bordered on sociopathic. I spent the entire weekend in a haze of confusion and hurt, trying to decide whether to confront David immediately or gather more information first. Part of me wanted to march into his office and demand an explanation for why he'd been secretly supporting my family while keeping me in the dark about our financial situation. But another part of me recognized that his deception, while painful, came from a place of genuine care for people I loved. He'd seen my parents struggling and my sister drowning in debt, and he'd found a way to help them that preserved their dignity and our family relationships. The fact that Melissa had perverted his kindness into something that threatened our marriage wasn't necessarily his fault. What troubled me most wasn't the money itself, but the pattern of secrets and lies that had apparently been shaping our family dynamics for years, without anyone acknowledging what was really happening. David had been playing the role of anonymous benefactor, while I played the role of loyal daughter and sister, never knowing that our ability to maintain those roles depended on deceptions that were becoming increasingly unsustainable. Melissa had been playing the role of independent young woman, while actually being completely financially dependent on the man she was trying to steal from me. My parents had been playing the role of proud, self-sufficient people, while actually being kept afloat by charity they didn't know they were receiving. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that David's financial support had inadvertently enabled some of Melissa's worst behaviors. Without the pressure of real financial consequences, she'd never had to develop genuine responsibility or face the natural results of her impulsive decisions. She could quit jobs on a whim, run up credit card debt, and make poor choices, because someone was always there to clean up the mess behind the scenes. In trying to help her, David had actually created a situation where she felt entitled to take whatever she wanted, including other people's husbands, because she'd never learned that actions have costs. I decided to confront David that Sunday evening, after spending the day rehearsing different versions of the conversation in my head. I waited until we'd finished dinner, and were sitting on our back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky over the hill country in shades of orange and pink, that reminded me of the early days of our relationship, when everything between us had been honest and uncomplicated. When I finally brought up the topic, I tried to keep my voice calm and non-accusatory, but I could hear the hurt creeping in, despite my best efforts. "I know about the money," I said simply, placing the investigator's report on the table between us. "I know you've been supporting my family for years, and I know you've been lying to me about it." David's face went white, and for a moment he looked like he might try to deny it or explain it away. But then his shoulders sagged, and I could see the relief in his expression at finally being able to stop pretending. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, and I could hear the shame in his voice. "I just found out this week," I told him. "But I've been suspicious about my family's financial situation for months. The timing of their improvements never made sense, and Melissa's lifestyle was obviously unsustainable on her income. I hired someone to investigate, because I thought she might be involved in something illegal or dangerous." David winced at that, probably realizing that his attempt to help had actually made me suspect my own sister of criminal activity. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I wanted to help them, but I knew they'd never accept money directly from us. Your dad is too proud, and your mom would have felt guilty about accepting charity. I thought if I could set up systems that made it look like they were getting help from government programs or random good luck, they could maintain their dignity while still getting the support they needed." His explanation made perfect sense, and I could see the genuine care behind his actions, which somehow made the betrayal hurt even more. "What about Melissa?" I asked, and I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice this time. "Did you think she deserved to maintain her dignity while she was using your money to seduce you?" David's face flushed red, and I could see that he'd been dreading this part of the conversation. "I didn't know she was going to do that when I started helping her," he said defensively. "And once her behavior became inappropriate, I couldn't figure out how to stop the financial support without exposing the whole arrangement and hurting your parents." That was the moment I realized how completely trapped we'd both become by the web of good intentions and hidden subsidies that David had created. He couldn't cut off Melissa's funding without revealing that he'd been lying to everyone for years, which would devastate my parents and destroy the trust they'd built with us. But continuing to support her while she tried to break up our marriage felt like rewarding her worst behavior and enabling even more destructive actions in the future. We were stuck in a situation where every possible choice seemed to lead to pain and broken relationships. "There's something else," David said, and I could tell from his tone that he was about to reveal something even more difficult. "Melissa knows. She figured out that the money was coming from me about 6 months ago, and she's been using that knowledge to manipulate the situation." My blood ran cold as the implications of this hit me. If Melissa knew that David was her secret benefactor, then her pursuit of him wasn't just about attraction or jealousy. It was about securing her financial future by seducing the man who controlled her lifestyle. "How did she find out?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. David looked uncomfortable, like he was admitting to something he knew had been a mistake. "She showed up at my office one day, claiming she needed to talk to me about a problem with her apartment lease. When I offered to help her find a solution, she said she already knew I'd been helping her all along, and she thanked me for being such a generous brother-in-law. She said she'd figured it out, because the timing of her good luck
always coincided with times when you'd mentioned her struggles to me. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Melissa hadn't just stumbled onto the truth about David's financial support. She'd been actively monitoring our conversations and looking for patterns that would reveal the source of her sudden wealth. Once she'd confirmed that David was behind her improved lifestyle, she'd apparently decided that the best way to secure that support permanently was to make him fall in love with her. It was calculated and predatory in a way that made me feel sick. "What did you tell her when she confronted you?" I asked, though I was increasingly afraid of what I might learn. David looked ashamed as he answered. "I asked her not to tell you or your parents, because I didn't want them to feel awkward about accepting help. She said she understood completely, and she promised to keep it between us. But then she started finding excuses to see me more often, always under the pretense of thanking me or updating me on how the money was helping her get her life together." I could see how Melissa had manipulated the situation to her advantage. By promising to keep David's secret, she'd created a sense of intimacy and conspiracy between them that excluded me. By positioning herself as grateful and reformed, she'd made him feel good about his generosity while also making him feel responsible for her continued well-being. And by gradually escalating her flirtation and seduction attempts, she'd been testing his boundaries while making it increasingly difficult for him to withdraw his support without seeming cruel or inconsistent. "She's been playing you," I told him, and I could see from his expression that he was beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. "Everything she's done since she found out about the money has been designed to make you feel responsible for her happiness and success. She's been using your generosity as a weapon against our marriage, and you've been enabling it by keeping secrets from me." David's face crumpled as the full scope of the situation became clear to him. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, and I could hear the genuine anguish in his voice. "I just wanted to help your family, and I thought keeping it secret would make it easier for everyone. I never imagined that Melissa would figure it out and use it against us." His regret seemed sincere, but it didn't change the fact that his well-intentioned deception had created a situation that was now threatening to destroy everything we'd built together. We spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out how to untangle the mess we'd found ourselves in. David wanted to cut off all financial support to Melissa immediately, regardless of the consequences, but I pointed out that doing so would raise questions from my parents that we weren't prepared to answer. If Melissa suddenly couldn't afford her lifestyle, she'd either have to explain where her money had been coming from or create some dramatic story that would likely make David and me look like the villains. Given her talent for manipulation and her apparent willingness to destroy our marriage to get what she wanted, I didn't trust her to handle the situation with any consideration for our well-being. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of our marriage. We had to acknowledge that David's deception, however well-intentioned, had fundamentally changed the dynamic of our relationship and our family. We were no longer equal partners making decisions together about how to handle our resources and responsibilities. Instead, David had been making unilateral choices about supporting my family while keeping me in the dark about our true financial situation. Meanwhile, I'd been operating under completely false assumptions about my family's independence and my sister's motivations. We also had to confront the reality that Melissa's behavior had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Her pursuit of David wasn't just inappropriate flirtation that could be forgiven and forgotten. It was a calculated campaign to break up our marriage, funded by money that she knew came from the man she was trying to steal. The level of betrayal and manipulation involved made it impossible to simply set boundaries and hope for better behavior in the future. We were dealing with someone who had proven herself willing to exploit generosity and twist family relationships to serve her own selfish purposes. By the end of that long, painful conversation, we'd reached several difficult decisions. First, David would continue the financial support for my parents, but we'd work together to gradually transition them to a more sustainable arrangement that didn't depend on ongoing deception. Second, we'd begin cutting off Melissa's support in ways that appeared to be natural consequences of changed circumstances rather than punishment for her behavior. And third, we'd be completely honest with each other going forward, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable the truth might be. What we didn't discuss that night was the plan that was already forming in the back of my mind. I'd been thinking about the $8 million from my app sale, money that David didn't even know I had. While he'd been supporting my family with his own resources, I'd been accumulating wealth that could completely change the power dynamic in our situation. For the first time since discovering Melissa's pursuit of my husband, I felt like I might have some control over what happened next. But using that control would require me to be just as deceptive as everyone else had been, at least temporarily. The irony wasn't lost on me that in order to save my marriage from the consequences of financial secrecy, I was going to have to keep my own financial secrets for a while longer. But unlike David's well-intentioned support of my family, my plans for my newfound wealth were focused on protection and justice rather than charity. Melissa had been using other people's generosity as a weapon against the relationships she envied. It was time for her to learn what happened when that weapon was turned back against her. Over the following weeks, I watched Melissa's behavior with new eyes, now understanding the financial incentives behind her actions. Every interaction with David became transparent in its manipulation. She'd call him with apartment emergencies that required immediate attention, creating opportunities to see him alone and test his boundaries. She'd show up at his office with homemade lunches, positioning herself as a caring and domestic alternative to me. She'd find excuses to touch him during conversations, gradually escalating the physical contact to see how much he'd tolerate. What made her behavior even more disturbing was how she incorporated expressions of gratitude into her seduction attempts. She'd thank him for being such a wonderful brother-in-law, while letting her hand linger on his arm. She'd tell him how lucky I was to have such a generous and caring husband while looking into his eyes with unmistakable longing. She was weaponizing his kindness and using his desire to help people as a tool to manipulate his emotions and create feelings of connection and intimacy. David, to his credit, became much more direct about shutting down her advances once we'd discussed the situation openly. But Melissa adapted quickly to his increased resistance, shifting her tactics from direct seduction to creating dramatic crises that required his intervention. She'd call him in tears about problems with her car, her apartment, or her job, always timing these emergencies for when she knew I was traveling for work or otherwise unavailable. When David would offer practical help or suggest involving me in finding solutions, she'd insist that she didn't want to burden me with her problems and beg him to keep their conversations confidential. The pattern was obvious once I knew what to look for, but it had been incredibly effective for months when David was operating under the assumption that Melissa was just a troubled young woman who needed guidance and support. Now that we both understood her true motivations, her manipulations seemed transparent and almost pathetic. But they'd been sophisticated enough to nearly destroy our marriage, and I knew that underestimating her capacity for deception and manipulation would be a dangerous mistake. As I prepared to implement my own plan for dealing with the situation, I found myself both disgusted by Melissa's behavior and oddly impressed by her strategic thinking. She'd identified the financial foundation of her improved lifestyle, secured it by creating intimacy with her benefactor, and then leveraged that relationship to pursue her ultimate goal of replacing me in David's affections. If her motivations had been less destructive and her methods less dishonest, her approach might have been admirable in its thoroughness and creativity. But admiration was the last thing I felt as I watched her continue to manipulate my husband and take advantage of my parents' ignorance about their true financial situation. She was using other people's generosity and love as weapons against the very relationships that had motivated that generosity in the first place. She was taking David's care for my family and twisting it into a tool for destroying my marriage. And she was doing it all while presenting herself as the innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control. The time had come to show Melissa what real power looked like, and what happened when someone with actual resources decided to play the game she'd been playing with borrowed money and manipulated emotions. She thought she understood manipulation and deception, but she'd been operating at an amateur level compared to what was possible when someone had both the motivation and the means to completely reshape the circumstances of everyone involved. My $8 million was about to become the foundation for a very different kind of family support system, one designed not to enable destructive behavior but to reveal it and create consequences that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Melissa had been living in a fantasy world where her actions had no real costs because someone else was always there to pay the bills. It was time for her to discover what reality looked like when the safety net was not only removed but turned into a trap that would catch her in all the lies she'd been telling. The first step in my plan required me to understand exactly how David's financial support system worked, so I could eventually replace it with something more strategic and purposeful. I spent several evenings going through the documents my investigator had provided, mapping out the network of shell companies, charitable foundations, and fake assistance programs that David had created to funnel money to my family. His system was actually quite sophisticated from a legal standpoint. He'd worked with lawyers and accountants to ensure that everything was legitimate and properly documented, even if the ultimate sources and motivations were hidden from the recipients. What impressed me most was how carefully David had crafted each element of the support system to match my family's personalities and psychological needs. For my parents, he'd created programs that appeared to be government assistance or community support, allowing them to maintain their pride and sense of self-sufficiency. The mortgage refinancing program came with official-looking documentation and required them to submit financial statements and proof of hardship, making it feel like something they'd earned rather than charity they'd received. Similarly, the Small Business Recovery Grant for my father's auto repair shop had come with requirements for progress reports and community involvement, giving my parents a sense of accountability and purpose. For Melissa, David had taken a completely different approach, recognizing that she thrived on excitement and the feeling of being specially chosen or favored by fate. Her financial support came through contest winnings, sweepstakes prizes, and promotional giveaways that fed her sense of being lucky and deserving of good things. She'd received gift cards to her favorite stores, cash prizes from radio stations she'd never listened to, and even a promotional car lease from a dealership that was supposedly celebrating their grand opening. Each windfall was designed to feel random and exciting, reinforcing Melissa's belief that she was naturally blessed with good fortune. The psychological sophistication of David's approach made me realize how deeply he'd been thinking about my family's emotional needs and individual personalities. He hadn't just thrown money at their problems, he'd crafted solutions that were specifically designed to make each person feel good about receiving help while preserving the relationship dynamics that he thought were healthy for our family. Unfortunately, he'd underestimated how those same personality traits could be weaponized against him when someone figured out what was really happening behind the scenes. As I studied the financial records, I began to see patterns that David himself might not have noticed. Melissa's support had gradually increased over time, not just in dollar amounts but in frequency and creativity. What had started as occasional contest winnings had evolved into a steady stream of financial windfalls that coincided perfectly with her spending patterns and lifestyle choices. David had been unconsciously training her to expect rescue from financial consequences, creating a feedback loop where her irresponsible behavior was consistently rewarded with mysterious good fortune. More troubling was the way Melissa's requests for David's direct help had increased alongside her anonymous financial support. She'd been testing the boundaries of their relationship by creating problems that required his personal intervention, not just his hidden financial assistance. The apartment emergencies, car troubles, and workplace dramas weren't just manipulative attempts to spend time with him. They were also ways of confirming that he would prioritize her needs and respond to her crises, even when doing so created tension in his marriage with me. The realization that David had been inadvertently training Melissa to manipulate him made me both angry and sad. His generosity had been genuine, and his intentions had been pure, but he'd created a monster without realizing it. Every time he'd rescued her from the consequences of poor decisions, he'd reinforced her belief that she could take whatever she wanted without paying any real price. Every time he'd kept her secrets and protected her from my parents' disappointment or my judgment, he'd taught her that deception and manipulation were effective tools for getting what she wanted. I began to understand that simply cutting off Melissa's financial support wouldn't be enough to change her behavior or protect my marriage. She'd already learned that David could be manipulated through appeals to his sense of responsibility and kindness. Even without the leverage of financial dependence, she'd continue to create crises and emergencies that would pull him into her orbit and away from me. I needed a strategy that would not only end her financial dependence, but also demonstrate the real costs of her manipulative behavior in ways that couldn't be ignored or explained away. My plan began to take shape around the idea of giving Melissa exactly what she thought she wanted, but in a way that would reveal the true nature of her desires and motivations. She thought she wanted David and the lifestyle his money could provide, but she'd never considered what it would actually cost her to achieve those goals. She'd been playing games with other people's emotions and resources, but she'd never faced an opponent who was willing to play by the same rules with higher stakes and better resources. The first phase of my strategy involved documenting everything. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction between Melissa and David, every financial transaction in her accounts, and every lie she told to our parents about her income and lifestyle. I installed discreet recording equipment in our home and David's office, with his knowledge and consent, so we'd have evidence of her manipulation attempts and inappropriate behavior. I also began monitoring her social media accounts and text messages, using the same investigative resources I'd employed to uncover David's financial support system. What I discovered through this surveillance was even worse than I'd expected. Melissa wasn't just trying to seduce David, she was actively working to sabotage our marriage through a campaign of lies and manipulation that extended far beyond her direct interactions with him. She'd been telling our extended family and mutual friends that David and I were having serious problems, that I was cold and unaffectionate, and that David had confided in her about feeling trapped and unhappy. She'd been positioning herself as his confidant and emotional support system, while simultaneously undermining his relationship with me. Even more disturbing were the text conversations she'd been having with her friend Brianna, where she outlined detailed plans for breaking up my marriage and positioning herself as David's next relationship. She'd researched divorce laws in Texas, calculated what David's assets might be worth in a settlement, and even looked into whether there were ways to challenge prenuptial agreements. She wasn't just having a crush or an affair, she was planning a complete life takeover that involved destroying my marriage, claiming David's resources, and positioning herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of betrayal. The level of premeditation and calculation involved in Melissa's campaign made me realize that I'd been far too passive in my response to her behavior. While I'd been trying to preserve family harmony and give her the benefit of the doubt, she'd been actively working to destroy everything I cared about. She'd been using my love for my family and my desire to avoid conflict as weapons against me, counting on my reluctance to create drama to give her room to operate without interference. But Melissa had made a crucial miscalculation in her planning. She'd assumed that David was the source of all the power and resources in our relationship, and that winning him would give her access to everything she wanted. She had no idea that I'd recently acquired my own substantial wealth, or that I had both the means and the motivation to completely change the rules of the game she thought she was playing. While she'd been focused on seducing my husband, I'd been building the foundation for a counterattack that would expose her true nature and create consequences she'd never considered. The key to my strategy was timing. I needed to wait for Melissa to commit to a course of action that would be impossible for her to explain away or retreat from gracefully. I needed her to cross a line so definitively that even our parents would be forced to acknowledge her behavior and hold her accountable for the damage she'd caused. And I needed to have all the pieces in place to demonstrate not just what she'd done, but what she'd been willing to sacrifice to get what she wanted. The opportunity I was waiting for came sooner than I expected, during what should have been a routine family gathering at my parents' house for my mother's birthday celebration. It was a warm September evening, and we'd all gathered in the backyard for a barbecue that reminded me of happier times when our family relationships had been simpler and more honest. David was helping my father with the grill, my mother was fussing over the side dishes, and Melissa was holding court at the picnic table with stories about her latest adventures and workplace drama. The evening started out pleasantly enough, with everyone in good spirits, and the conversation flowing easily between topics like my mother's new hobby of painting, my father's plans for expanding his auto repair business, and David's latest architecture projects. But I noticed that Melissa kept steering conversations toward topics that would allow her to display her knowledge of David's work and their supposedly close relationship. She'd ask detailed questions about his current projects and reference conversations they'd supposedly had about his professional challenges and goals. What made this performance particularly manipulative was how she framed these displays of insider knowledge. She'd preface her comments with phrases like David mentioned to me, or when David was telling me about, making it sound like they'd been having intimate conversations about his work life that didn't include me. To someone who didn't know about her campaign to seduce him, it might have seemed like normal family conversation. But I could see how she was trying to plant seeds of doubt about the communication in my marriage, while positioning herself as someone who really understood and appreciated David's professional life. The evening took a dramatic turn when Melissa announced that she had some exciting news to share with the family. She waited until we were all gathered around the table, finishing dessert and enjoying the comfortable atmosphere, before standing up and asking for everyone's attention. The timing was calculated to maximize the impact of whatever she was about to reveal, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach as I watched her prepare to deliver what was obviously going to be another manipulative performance. "I've been keeping a secret for the past few weeks," she began, her voice trembling with what appeared to be emotion, but what I recognized as carefully rehearsed drama. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, and I didn't want to overshadow Mom's birthday celebration, but I can't keep it to myself any longer." She paused for effect, looking around the table at each of us, with an expression that managed to combine joy, nervousness, and something that looked almost like guilt. "I'm pregnant," she announced, and the words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite exploded yet. My parents immediately erupted in excitement and congratulations, rushing to hug her and asking a dozen questions about due dates and doctor visits, and whether she'd told the father yet. David went completely still beside me, his fork halfway to his mouth, and I could see the blood draining from his face as he processed what she'd just said and what it might mean. But Melissa wasn't finished with her announcement. As my parents continued to celebrate and fuss over her, she looked directly at David with an expression that I can only describe as triumphant mixed with apology. "The thing is," she continued, her voice getting softer and more hesitant, "it's complicated. The father is someone who's already married, someone who's been incredibly kind and supportive to me during a difficult time in my life. We never meant for anything to happen, but sometimes feelings develop even when you know they shouldn't." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. My parents stopped celebrating and looked confused and concerned, clearly trying to process what she was implying. David dropped his fork entirely and stared at her with an expression of complete shock and horror. And Melissa continued to look at him with that same mixture of triumph and false regret, as if she was sorry for the situation, but proud of what she'd accomplished. "Melissa," my mother said carefully, "what exactly are you saying? Who is the father?" But before Melissa could answer, David found his voice and spoke with a firmness I'd rarely heard from him. "Whatever you're implying, it's not true," he said, looking directly at her. "I have never been inappropriate with you, and I am definitely not the father of any child you might be carrying." Melissa's response was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as wounded vulnerability. Her eyes filled with tears, and she brought her hands up to cover her face as if she was overwhelmed by shame and regret. "I know this is difficult for everyone," she said through her apparent tears, "and I know it puts David in an impossible position. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but I can't deny what happened between us, or pretend that this baby doesn't exist." What followed was chaos. My father started demanding explanations and threatening to throw David out of the house. My mother was trying to calm everyone down, while asking Melissa for more details about when this supposed affair had taken place. David was insisting on his innocence, and looking at me with desperate eyes that begged me to believe him. And Melissa continued to sob, and claim that she never wanted to cause problems, but couldn't keep lying about the situation. In the middle of this family meltdown, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the line that Melissa couldn't uncross or explain away. She'd finally committed to a lie so big and destructive that it would either destroy my marriage completely or give me the opportunity to expose her completely. Either way, there would be no more pretending that she was just a harmless flirt, or that her behavior could be overlooked in the interest of family harmony. I stood up from the table, and something in my posture must have commanded attention, because everyone stopped arguing and looked at me. "I think we all need to calm down and think about this situation clearly," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Melissa, you're claiming that you're pregnant with my husband's child, and David is denying that anything inappropriate ever happened between you. Obviously one of you is lying, and we need to figure out which one before we tear our family apart over accusations and denials." Melissa looked at me with an expression that I now realize was surprise mixed with calculation. She'd expected me to either collapse in devastation or explode in anger, not respond with calm logic and a request for evidence. "I'm not lying, Jessica," she said, her voice still trembling, but with a note of defiance creeping in. "I know this is painful for you to hear, but David and I have been having an affair for months. We never meant for it to happen, but we fell in love, and now we're going to have a baby together." The boldness of her lie was breathtaking, but it was also exactly what I needed to implement the plan I'd been developing for weeks. "If that's really true," I said, still maintaining my calm tone, "then we need to verify it with medical evidence and documentation. We need to confirm that you're actually pregnant, determine the dates of conception, and if necessary, arrange for paternity testing once the baby is born. And we need to do all of this through official channels with professional medical supervision, not through accusations and denials around the dinner table." My response clearly wasn't what Melissa had expected. She'd counted on creating an emotional explosion that would divide the family and force everyone to choose sides based on loyalty rather than evidence. Instead, I was treating her announcement like a problem to be solved through investigation and documentation, which would ultimately expose the lies she'd built her entire scheme around. David immediately agreed to any testing or verification that might be necessary to prove his innocence, while Melissa began backtracking and claiming that she didn't want to put the family through the trauma of medical procedures and legal processes. She tried to reframe the situation as
Such a serious accusation required serious investigation and proof. The evening ended with my parents confused and upset. David determined to clear his name through whatever means necessary, and Melissa realizing that her dramatic announcement hadn't achieved the results she'd anticipated. Instead of destroying my marriage and positioning herself as David's new partner, she'd created a situation where her lies would be subjected to scrutiny that she couldn't survive. As we drove home that night, David was quiet and tense, clearly processing the magnitude of what had just happened and what it might mean for our future. "Do you believe me?" he finally asked as we pulled into our driveway, and I could hear the fear in his voice that his financial deception might have destroyed my trust in him completely. "I believe you about the affair," I told him, "but we both know that Melissa has information and leverage that she's been using against you for months. The question now is whether she's desperate enough to maintain this lie even when it can be easily disproven, or whether she has some other plan that we haven't figured out yet." David nodded grimly, understanding that we were dealing with someone whose capacity for deception and manipulation was deeper than either of us had initially realized. What neither of us knew at the time was that Melissa's pregnancy announcement was just the opening move in a much more elaborate scheme. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, and she had backup strategies and supporting evidence that she thought would make her lies impossible to disprove. She'd underestimated my determination to protect my marriage and my willingness to use every resource at my disposal to expose her deception, but she'd also prepared for the possibility that her initial announcement wouldn't be immediately accepted at face value. The real battle was just beginning, and Melissa had no idea that she was about to face an opponent who had been preparing for this confrontation with resources and strategies that went far beyond anything she'd anticipated. While she'd been focused on manipulating emotions and exploiting family loyalties, I'd been building a comprehensive plan for exposing her lies and creating consequences that would finally teach her what it cost to try to destroy other people's lives for personal gain. The days following Melissa's pregnancy announcement were filled with a tension that permeated every aspect of our lives. David threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, staying late at the office and taking on new projects that required his complete attention. I knew he was struggling with guilt and anger about the situation Melissa had created, even though he'd done nothing wrong beyond being too trusting and generous with someone who'd weaponized his kindness against him. Meanwhile, my parents called daily with updates on Melissa's condition and subtle questions about whether David and I were seeking counseling to work through this difficult time. What my parents didn't know was that I'd been conducting my own investigation into Melissa's claims, using resources and connections that went far beyond anything my family could have imagined. Within 24 hours of her announcement, I'd hired a medical investigator who specialized in verifying pregnancy claims and medical fraud. I'd also retained a private security firm to conduct comprehensive surveillance of Melissa's activities, communications, and financial transactions. If she was lying about the pregnancy, I was going to have ironclad proof. If she was telling the truth, I needed to know exactly how and when it had happened so I could determine whether David was being honest with me about his involvement. The medical investigation yielded results faster than I'd expected. According to the comprehensive background check, Melissa had indeed visited several medical facilities in the Austin area over the past month, but not for prenatal care.
Instead, she'd been to 3 different urgent care clinics complaining of nausea and fatigue, seeking documentation of symptoms that could be interpreted as early pregnancy signs. She'd also made purchases at medical supply stores, buying items typically used for home pregnancy tests and urine collection. Most telling of all, she'd been researching online forums dedicated to faking pregnancy symptoms and had downloaded several pregnancy tracking apps despite never having visited an actual obstetrician. The surveillance reports painted an even clearer picture of Melissa's deception. In the week leading up to her announcement, she'd met repeatedly with her friend Brianna, who worked as a medical administrative assistant at a family practice clinic. Security footage from a coffee shop near Brianna's workplace showed them exchanging documents and discussing what appeared to be detailed plans. Phone records revealed that Melissa had been calling pregnancy hotlines and family planning clinics, not to schedule appointments, but to gather information about typical pregnancy timelines and symptoms that would be consistent with her claimed conception date. Most damning of all was a recording my surveillance team had obtained of a conversation between Melissa and Brianna, in which they discussed the specific details of how to maintain the pregnancy deception long enough to get David committed to leaving Jessica. Brianna had apparently provided Melissa with blank medical forms from her clinic, which Melissa planned to fill out with fake test results and appointment notes. They'd even researched the timeline for when a pregnancy would typically be far enough along to require David to make a definitive choice about leaving me, calculating that they had approximately 8 to 10 weeks to make their plan work before the lies became impossible to maintain. Armed with this evidence, I faced a critical decision about how to proceed. I could expose Melissa immediately and end her deception before it caused any more damage to my family relationships. But doing so would also reveal the extent of my surveillance capabilities and financial resources, information that I wasn't ready to share with my family yet. I'd learned enough about the dynamics of manipulation and control to understand that revealing my true power too early would allow people to adjust their behavior and find new ways to exploit or circumvent my advantages. Instead, I decided to let Melissa's deception play out a little longer while I prepared a more comprehensive response that would address not just her fake pregnancy, but the entire web of lies and financial manipulation that had been poisoning my family relationships for years. I wanted to create a situation where all the truth came out at once, in a way that would be impossible for anyone to deny or rationalize away. Melissa had been playing a game of deception and manipulation, but she'd never faced an opponent who was willing to play the same game with superior resources and a deeper understanding of the stakes involved. The opportunity to implement my plan came when Melissa suggested that the family should gather for a weekend reunion at Lake Travis, where we could work through this difficult situation together and figure out how to move forward as a family despite everything that had happened. She positioned this gathering as a chance for healing and honest communication, but I recognized it as another manipulation designed to pressure David into making a public commitment to her in front of our extended family. She'd invited not just our immediate family, but cousins, aunts, and uncles who would serve as witnesses to whatever dramatic revelation she was planning to stage. I agreed to the reunion enthusiastically, telling Melissa that I thought it was exactly what our family needed to get past this crisis and rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty and trust. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent the intervening weeks preparing evidence and documentation that would expose not just her fake pregnancy, but every lie she'd told and every dollar she'd taken under false pretenses for the past 3 years. I'd also arranged for several surprise guests who would help me present the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The reunion was scheduled for a Saturday in October, when the Texas heat had finally broken and the lake was perfect for swimming and boating. My parents had rented a large pavilion at one of the state parks, and family members had been arriving since Friday evening to set up tents and trailers for what was supposed to be a healing weekend together. The atmosphere should have been festive and relaxed, but I could feel the underlying tension as people tried to navigate the awkward dynamics created by Melissa's pregnancy announcement and the questions it had raised about David's fidelity and my marriage's stability. Melissa had clearly been preparing for this weekend as intensively as I had, but her preparations were focused on emotional manipulation rather than factual evidence. She'd been calling family members individually to share her version of events, painting herself as a woman caught between love and loyalty who was trying to do the right thing despite impossible circumstances. She'd been emphasizing her pregnancy symptoms and her emotional fragility, setting up expectations that she needed to be protected and supported rather than questioned or challenged. The weekend began with the usual reunion activities: swimming, fishing, barbecuing, and catching up on family news and gossip. But I could see Melissa working the crowd systematically, having private conversations with different family members, and building support for whatever revelation she was planning to make. She'd been particularly focused on my father's older brother, Uncle Roberto, who'd always been protective of her, and who carried significant influence with the rest of the extended family. If she could get Uncle Roberto on her side, she'd have a powerful ally when the confrontation finally came. David spent most of Saturday trying to act normal and relaxed, but I could see the strain in his face, and the way he avoided being alone with any family members who might want to discuss the situation privately. He'd been dreading this weekend since Melissa first suggested it, knowing that he'd be walking into a situation where he'd be surrounded by people who'd heard her version of events, and might be predisposed to believe her rather than him. The fact that he was willing to face that scrutiny and potential hostility demonstrated his commitment to our marriage and his confidence in his own innocence. As evening approached and the family gathered around the fire pit for what had always been our traditional time for sharing stories and making announcements, I could feel Melissa's excitement and anticipation building. She'd been drinking wine throughout the day, using her supposed pregnancy as an excuse to be emotional and unpredictable, and I could tell that she was preparing to make another dramatic revelation that would force the family to choose sides definitively. This was her moment, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation, and she was ready to claim the victory she thought she'd earned. But before Melissa could launch into whatever performance she'd prepared, I stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "Before we get into family business and difficult conversations," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the circle of chairs and benches around the fire, "I have some things I need to share with all of you. Things that will change how we understand what's been happening in our family for the past few years, and why we're dealing with the situation we're facing tonight." I could see Melissa's face change as she realized that I was taking control of the narrative before she'd had a chance to present her version of events. She started to interrupt, claiming that she had important things to share too, but I held up my hand and continued speaking with an authority that I'd never used with my family before. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, and it involves information that some of you weren't meant to know. But given the accusations that have been made, and the damage that's been done to relationships I care about, I think it's time for complete honesty about money, manipulation, and the lies that have been shaping our family dynamics." The circle fell completely silent as I reached into the bag I'd brought and pulled out a thick folder of documents. 3 years ago, I began, someone in this family became secretly wealthy and decided to use that wealth to help the people they loved, without seeking credit or recognition for their generosity. That person created fake assistance programs, false contest winnings, and fraudulent refinancing opportunities to funnel money to family members who were struggling financially. The amounts involved were substantial, hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years, and the deception was so sophisticated that the recipients never questioned where their sudden good fortune was coming from. I could see confusion and concern spreading across the faces of my family members as they tried to process what I was telling them and figure out how it related to the pregnancy drama we'd all been dealing with. My parents looked particularly uncomfortable, probably wondering if their mortgage refinancing program was about to be revealed as something other than the legitimate government assistance they'd believed it to be. "The person who provided this secret support," I continued, "believed they were helping family members maintain their dignity while getting the financial assistance they needed. They created systems that made the support look like luck or merit-based aid rather than charity. And for a while this arrangement seemed to work well for everyone involved. But then one of the recipients figured out where the money was really coming from, and instead of being grateful for the generosity, they decided to use that knowledge as a weapon against the very person who'd been helping them." Melissa's face had gone completely white, and I could see her trying to figure out how much I knew and how I'd learned it. She'd been so focused on manipulating David and planning her pregnancy deception that she'd never considered the possibility that someone might be investigating her activities and gathering evidence of her lies. She'd assumed that her charm and family loyalty would protect her from serious scrutiny, just as they always had in the past. "The recipient who discovered the truth about their financial support," I said, looking directly at Melissa, "began using that information to manipulate and seduce the person who'd been helping them. They leveraged the secrecy around the financial arrangement to create inappropriate intimacy and emotional connection. They used their benefactor's kindness and generosity as tools to break up a marriage and steal a life that belonged to someone else. And when their seduction attempts weren't working fast enough, they decided to claim pregnancy and paternity to force the situation to a crisis point. The family erupted in shocked murmurs and questions as the implications of what I was saying began to sink in. Uncle Roberto demanded to know who I was talking about and what evidence I had for such serious accusations. My mother started crying, probably realizing that her mortgage assistance hadn't been the blessing she'd thought it was. And my father sat in stunned silence, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and what looked like deep embarrassment. But before anyone could derail the conversation with questions and denials, I pulled out a tablet and connected it to a portable speaker I'd brought for this exact purpose. Rather than ask you to take my word for what's been happening, I said, I think it's better to let you hear it directly from the people involved. I pressed play on an audio recording that my surveillance team had obtained just 2 days earlier, featuring Melissa and Brianna, discussing the final details of how to maintain the pregnancy deception through the family reunion. Melissa's voice came through the speaker clearly as she explained to Brianna how she planned to seal the deal with David by creating a situation where he'd have to choose between leaving me or abandoning his pregnant sister-in-law in front of the entire family. She talked about how she'd been playing the long game for over a year, using David's financial support to fund her lifestyle while working to make him fall in love with her. She laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate someone so sweet and stupid, and how she couldn't wait to finally get everything Jessica has always taken for granted. The reaction to this recording was immediate and explosive. My parents started shouting at Melissa, demanding explanations and apologies. Uncle Roberto, who'd been prepared to defend her against whatever accusations I might make, sat in shocked silence as he processed the casual cruelty in her voice and the calculated nature of her deception. David looked like he was going to be sick, finally understanding the full scope of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated and used. But Melissa wasn't ready to surrender without a fight. Even faced with recorded evidence of her lies and manipulation, she tried to claim that the conversation had been taken out of context and that I'd somehow edited or fabricated the recording to make her look bad. She insisted that she really was pregnant and that David really was the father, regardless of what some fake recording might suggest. She appealed to family loyalty and claimed that I was trying to destroy her out of jealousy and spite. That's when I played my final card. I pulled out a medical report from a clinic that Melissa had never been to, a comprehensive pregnancy test and examination that had been conducted without her knowledge using biological samples that my investigators had obtained from her apartment and workplace. The report definitively proved that she was not pregnant and had never been pregnant during the time frame she'd claimed. More than that, it included evidence that she'd been using hormone supplements to create false positive results on home pregnancy tests and had been researching medications that could mimic early pregnancy symptoms. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Even Melissa seemed to realize that she'd finally been caught in lies that couldn't be explained away or rationalized. The medical evidence was irrefutable, and combined with the recorded conversations and financial documentation, it painted a picture of deception and manipulation that was impossible to deny. For the first time in her life, Melissa was facing consequences for her actions that couldn't be charmed or cried away. But I wasn't finished yet. There's one more thing you all need to know, I said, pulling out another set of documents. The secret benefactor who's been supporting this family of yours wasn't David. It was me. The gasps and shocked expressions that greeted this revelation told me that nobody had suspected the truth about my financial situation, just as I'd intended. 2 years ago, I sold an app I'd developed to Microsoft for $8 million. I continued. I used that money to create the same kind of support systems for our family that David had been funding from his business income. I took over the financial arrangements he'd established and expanded them because I wanted to help everyone I loved without changing our family dynamics or creating awkwardness around money. I thought I was being kind and generous, just like David had been. But I was actually enabling behavior that was destructive and unsustainable. The revelation that I was the source of their financial support seemed to hit my family even harder than the exposure of Melissa's lies. My parents realized that their improved lifestyle and financial security had come from their daughter's charity rather than their own efforts or luck. Melissa understood that she'd been using my money to fund her campaign to steal my husband, adding a layer of irony to her betrayal that was almost poetic in its justice. Effective immediately, I announced, all financial support ends. The mortgage assistance, the contest winnings, the business grants, all of it stops today. Everyone in this family is going to learn what it means to live within their actual means and face the real consequences of their choices. Melissa, you have 30 days to find a way to pay your own rent and car payment, or figure out where you're going to live when you get evicted. Mom and Dad, you have 60 days to either qualify for a legitimate refinancing program or put the house on the market and find something you can actually afford. The family meeting devolved into chaos as everyone tried to process what they'd learned and figure out what it meant for their immediate futures. Melissa attempted to maintain her victim narrative, claiming that I was punishing everyone because of her mistakes, but the recorded evidence of her manipulation had destroyed any sympathy she might have otherwise received. My parents alternated between gratitude for the years of help I'd provided and humiliation at learning they'd been charity cases without knowing it. David sat quietly through most of the confrontation, probably wondering how many more secrets our family had been keeping from each other. In the days that followed the reunion, the dynamics of our entire family shifted permanently. Melissa, faced with the reality of having to support herself without secret financial assistance or family sympathy, initially tried to find another benefactor to replace the support she'd lost. But word of her deception had spread through our extended family and social circles, making it difficult for her to find anyone willing to trust her with money or emotional investment. She eventually moved back in with my parents temporarily, but even they struggled to maintain patience with her after learning the full scope of her lies and manipulation. My parents surprised me by adapting to their new financial reality with more grace and resilience than I'd expected. The humiliation of learning they'd been accepting charity was painful, but it also motivated them to take control of their finances in ways they hadn't done in years. My father expanded his auto repair business and started taking on more challenging projects that paid better. My mother developed her bookkeeping skills and began building a client base that could provide steady income. Within 6 months, they'd qualified for a legitimate mortgage modification that made their house payments manageable on their actual income. David and I faced our own challenges in rebuilding trust and communication after years of financial secrecy and manipulation. We started couples counseling to work through the damage that had been done to our relationship, not just by Melissa's deception but by our own choices to keep secrets from each other about money and family support. It took time to establish new patterns of honesty and transparency, but we eventually emerged from the crisis with a stronger marriage and a clearer understanding of our values and priorities. The most difficult part of the aftermath was learning to live with the knowledge of how thoroughly our family relationships had been corrupted by lies and financial manipulation. Everyone had been playing roles and keeping secrets that had prevented us from developing authentic connections with each other. The process of rebuilding those relationships on a foundation of honesty was painful and slow, but it was also necessary if we wanted to have real family bonds rather than relationships based on dependency and deception. As for Melissa, she eventually moved to Houston and started over with a new job and a fresh group of people who didn't know about her history of manipulation and lies. We maintained minimal contact for several years, exchanging holiday cards and brief updates through my parents, but the trust between us had been too thoroughly destroyed to rebuild. She'd made choices that revealed the person she really was underneath the charm and charisma, and that person wasn't someone I could safely have in my life. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the dangers of trying to help people in ways that shield them from the natural consequences of their choices. Good intentions and financial resources can't fix character flaws or create healthy relationships where they don't already exist. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full reality of their situation and learn to take responsibility for their own lives, even if that process is difficult and painful to watch. Looking back on that period of my life, I'm grateful for what I learned about manipulation, family dynamics, and the complex relationship between money and power. Melissa's attempt to steal my husband and destroy my marriage ultimately failed, but it succeeded in forcing me to examine the ways I'd been enabling unhealthy behavior and avoiding difficult conversations with people I loved. The confrontation was painful for everyone involved, but it cleared the air and created space for more honest relationships to develop. Years later, when people ask me about dealing with family betrayal and manipulation, I always emphasize the importance of gathering evidence before taking action. Maintaining your emotional equilibrium during confrontations, and being prepared for the fact that some relationships may not survive the truth. Not everyone deserves unlimited chances to hurt you, even if they're family. Sometimes protecting yourself and your marriage requires making hard choices that other people won't understand or approve of. The sister who faked pregnancy to steal my husband learned that her actions had consequences she'd never considered. But more importantly, I learned that I had the strength and resources to protect what mattered most to me, even when it meant going against family expectations and social pressure to forgive and forget. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, regardless of how much drama and conflict that choice might create in the short term. The weeks following David's confession about his financial support created a strange paradox in our marriage. We were more honest with each other than we'd ever been, sharing every detail about the money, the manipulation, and the ways Melissa had exploited his generosity. Yet underneath this newfound transparency, I was harboring the biggest secret of all. The $8 million that had transformed me from a comfortable middle-class software engineer into someone with the power to completely reshape our family's dynamics and my sister's future. Every day I spent planning my counterattack while David believed we were navigating this crisis together as equals felt like another small betrayal, but I justified it by telling myself that some secrets were strategic rather than deceptive. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I was criticizing David for keeping financial secrets while simultaneously building an elaborate plan based on resources he knew nothing about. But the difference, I convinced myself, was that his secrets had enabled destructive behavior, while mine would ultimately expose and correct it. David's hidden generosity had accidentally created a monster. My hidden wealth would be used to slay it. The moral distinction felt important, even though I knew it was probably just rationalization for doing exactly what I'd condemned him for doing. My first step
in developing a comprehensive response was to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I hired a forensic accountant to trace every dollar David had spent supporting my family, and the results were even more extensive than his initial confession had suggested. Over the course of nearly 3 years, he'd transferred almost $400,000 to various shell companies and charitable foundations that had then distributed the money to my parents and Melissa. The amounts had started small, miss a few $100s here and there to cover unexpected expenses, but had gradually escalated as my family's financial needs grew and their dependence on the mysterious assistance deepened. What troubled me most about the financial analysis was how clearly it showed the correlation between David's increased support and Melissa's increasingly bold behavior toward him. Every time he'd rescued her from a financial crisis or provided funding for some new opportunity, she'd interpreted it as evidence of his special feelings for her and had escalated her attempts to seduce him. His kindness had been feeding her delusions and encouraging her to believe that he was dissatisfied with our marriage and looking for a way to justify leaving me for her. The forensic accountant also uncovered evidence that Melissa had been conducting her own investigation into David's finances, using her access to his personal information through family gatherings and shared activities to research his business income and assets. She'd been systematically gathering intelligence about his wealth and lifestyle, not out of casual curiosity, but as part of a calculated assessment of what she could gain by successfully seducing him. She'd even researched divorce laws and property division rules in Texas, studying what she might be entitled to if she managed to break up our marriage and establish a relationship with David. This level of premeditation transformed my understanding of what we were dealing with. Melissa wasn't just having an inappropriate crush on her sister's husband or making impulsive decisions based on attraction and jealousy. She was conducting a deliberate campaign to destroy my marriage and steal my life, complete with financial planning and legal research. She'd been treating our family relationships like a business opportunity, calculating potential returns on her investment of time and manipulation. Armed with this knowledge, I began developing a multi-phase plan that would not only expose Melissa's deception but also establish new foundations for our family relationships based on honesty and accountability, rather than hidden subsidies and enabling behaviors. The plan would require me to reveal my own financial situation eventually, but I wanted to control the timing and context of that revelation to maximize its impact and minimize the chances that it could be used against me. Phase 1 involved documenting everything. I hired a private investigation firm that specialized in family disputes and financial fraud to conduct comprehensive surveillance of Melissa's activities. I wanted detailed records of her spending patterns, her communications with friends and potential accomplices, and her continued attempts to manipulate David and undermine our marriage. I also had them investigate her claims about her income and employment, suspecting that she'd been lying about more than just her feelings for my husband. The surveillance results confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed deceptions I hadn't even considered. Melissa had been systematically lying to our entire family about virtually every aspect of her life. Her part-time job at the boutique was actually even more limited than she'd claimed. She worked fewer than 15 hours per week and had been written up multiple times for attendance and attitude problems.
Her supervisor described her as unreliable and entitled, someone who expected special treatment and became hostile when held to the same standards as other employees. More disturbing were the recordings of her conversations with friends, where she talked openly about her plans to seduce David and claim his assets. She'd been bragging about how easy it was to manipulate someone so desperate to be the good guy, and how she was confident she could make him leave me within 6 months. She'd even been taking bets with some of her friends about how long it would take her to break up our marriage, treating the destruction of my life like a game with entertaining stakes. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Melissa had been stealing from our parents for years, taking cash from their wallets and small valuable items from their home that she could sell online. The amounts were individually small enough to avoid detection, but when added up over time, they represented thousands of dollars in theft from people who were already struggling financially. She'd been supplementing David's secret support with money stolen from our parents, creating a double betrayal that made me physically sick to contemplate. Phase 2 of my plan involved strategic financial positioning. I began quietly liquidating some of my investments and consolidating resources in ways that would give me maximum flexibility and impact when the time came to take action. I also started researching the most effective ways to terminate David's existing support systems without causing immediate financial catastrophe for my parents, who were innocent victims of both his well-intentioned deception and Melissa's exploitation. I worked with financial advisors and attorneys to create legitimate assistance programs that could replace David's fake foundations and shell companies with transparent, accountable support systems. If my parents were going to receive help, I wanted it to come with clear terms and expectations rather than the open-ended enabling that had been corrupting our family dynamics. I also established strict criteria for any future support, including requirements for financial counseling and regular progress reviews. For Melissa, I designed a very different approach. Instead of cutting off her support immediately, I decided to take control of it gradually, using the same shell company structures that David had created but redirecting them to serve my purposes rather than hers. I began monitoring her spending more closely and started introducing artificial delays and complications into her financial windfall system. Contest winnings became smaller and less frequent. Sweepstakes prizes started coming with more restrictions and requirements. The mysterious good fortune that had been funding her lifestyle began to feel less reliable and more conditional. The psychological impact of these changes on Melissa was immediate and revealing. As her easy money became less predictable, she ramped up her direct appeals to David for help and support. She started creating more frequent emergencies and crises that required his personal intervention, testing whether she could replace financial manipulation with emotional manipulation as her primary tool for maintaining his attention and assistance. Her behavior became more desperate and less subtle, which made it easier to document her inappropriate conduct and manipulation attempts. Phase 3 involved preparing for the ultimate confrontation. I knew that eventually I would need to expose everything David's secret support, Melissa's manipulation and theft, and my own hidden wealth and surveillance activities. But I wanted to control the circumstances of that revelation to ensure maximum impact and minimum opportunity for deflection or denial. I needed a situation where all the evidence could be presented at once, in front of witnesses who couldn't be manipulated or intimidated into ignoring what they were seeing. The opportunity came when Melissa suggested the family reunion at Lake Travis. I recognized immediately that she was planning to use the gathering as a stage for some kind of dramatic revelation or ultimatum designed to force David into making a public choice between her and me. She'd been building toward this kind of confrontation for months, and the family setting would give her access to potential allies and witnesses who might support her version of events over ours. But what Melissa didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of situation. I had months of surveillance footage, financial records, and documented evidence of her lies and manipulation. I had professional investigators who could testify to her deception and theft, and I had resources that would allow me to completely change the rules of whatever game she thought she was playing. The week before the reunion, I made my final preparations. I arranged for my investigative team to be present at the lake, disguised as other park visitors but equipped to document everything that happened. I prepared comprehensive evidence packets for every adult family member, containing financial records, surveillance reports, and audio recordings that would make denial impossible. And I practiced my presentation, rehearsing different versions of the confrontation depending on how Melissa chose to launch her attack. I also made peace with the possibility that this confrontation would permanently damage my relationship with some family members. My parents might never forgive me for the years of financial deception, even though my motivations had been generous. Extended family members might side with Melissa out of misplaced loyalty or discomfort with the level of surveillance and documentation I'd employed. David might struggle with the revelation that I'd been keeping secrets even while criticizing him for doing the same thing. But I'd reached a point where preserving false peace was less important than establishing genuine truth. My marriage was worth fighting for, even if that fight required me to reveal uncomfortable realities about money, manipulation, and the ways family loyalty could be weaponized against the people who deserved it most. Melissa had been counting on my reluctance to create family drama, using my desire for harmony as a shield for her destructive behavior. It was time to show her that some things were more important than keeping everyone comfortable. The confrontation at Lake Travis exceeded even my expectations for drama and revelation. When I played the recordings of Melissa's conversations about her plans to seduce David and steal his assets, the shock on my family's faces was profound and heartbreaking. These were people who'd loved and supported her for years, who'd made excuses for her irresponsible behavior and believed her lies about her income and lifestyle. Hearing her casual cruelty and calculated manipulation in her own voice shattered their illusions about who she really was. But the moment that changed everything was when I revealed my own financial situation and announced that I'd been the source of the family's mysterious good fortune for years. The silence that followed this revelation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My parents looked at me with expressions that combined gratitude, humiliation, and confusion, struggling to process the reality that their daughter had been supporting them while they'd been worrying about their financial security and feeling grateful for government assistance programs that didn't actually exist. Melissa's reaction was the most complex and disturbing. Even faced with irrefutable evidence of her lies and manipulation, she tried to position herself as the victim of my surveillance and financial control. She claimed that I'd been manipulating the entire family through money, and that her relationship with David was the only genuine connection in a web of financial deception and control. It was a masterful attempt at deflection that might have worked with a less prepared opponent, but I had too much evidence and too many witnesses for her victim narrative to gain traction. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was chaotic and painful. Family members who'd been shocked by the evidence struggled to reconcile their love for Melissa with the reality of her calculated betrayal. My parents oscillated between anger at her deception and humiliation about their financial dependence on me. David remained largely silent throughout the confrontation, probably processing the revelation that I'd been conducting my own deceptive campaign while criticizing him for his secrets. But in the days and weeks that followed, the family began to adapt to the new reality I'd created. Without the safety net of mysterious financial support, everyone was forced to confront their actual circumstances and make genuine choices about their futures. My parents discovered that they were more resilient and capable than they'd believed, finding ways to manage their finances and maintain their independence without hidden subsidies. Extended family members gradually came to understand that the confrontation, however painful, had been necessary to stop a destructive pattern of manipulation and lies. Melissa struggled the most with the transition to reality. Cut off from both David's secret support and my replacement funding, she was forced to live within her actual means for the first time in years. The adjustment was difficult and humbling, but it also created opportunities for genuine growth and change that had been impossible while she was insulated from the consequences of her choices. David and I faced our own challenges in rebuilding trust and intimacy after years of mutual deception. The revelation that I'd been conducting surveillance and keeping financial secrets while criticizing him for similar behavior created tension that took months to resolve. But our shared commitment to complete honesty going forward, combined with professional counseling and a lot of difficult conversations, eventually allowed us to emerge from the crisis with a stronger marriage than we'd had before. The most important lesson I learned from this experience was that good intentions don't justify deceptive methods, even when those methods are employed to help people you love. David's secret financial support had been motivated by genuine care for my family, but it had enabled destructive behavior and created dependency relationships that ultimately harmed everyone involved. My own deception and surveillance, while effective in exposing Melissa's manipulation, had required me to become the kind of person I'd been criticizing David for being. Moving forward, we established new principles for our family relationships based on transparency, accountability, and genuine consequences for choices and behaviors. We created legitimate support systems for family members who needed help, but with clear terms and expectations that encouraged growth rather than dependence. We maintained appropriate boundaries around money and personal relationships, refusing to allow financial considerations to override honest communication and healthy dynamics.
Years later, when I look back on that period of our lives, I'm grateful for what it taught me about power, manipulation, and the importance of standing up for what matters most, even when doing so requires difficult choices and painful confrontations. Melissa's attempt to destroy my marriage ultimately failed, but it succeeded in forcing our entire family to examine the ways we'd been avoiding truth and enabling unhealthy behavior through misguided kindness and misplaced loyalty. The sister who faked pregnancy to steal my husband learned that actions have consequences that can't be charmed or manipulated away. But more importantly, I learned that protecting what you love sometimes requires you to be willing to risk everything, including the approval and comfort of people whose opinions matter to you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, regardless of how much short-term pain that choice might cause. The experience transformed me from someone who avoided conflict and prioritized harmony over truth into someone who understood the importance of establishing and maintaining boundaries, even with family members. It taught me that real love sometimes requires difficult choices and that protecting people from the consequences of their actions isn't actually kindness, it's enabling that prevents growth and perpetuates harmful patterns. In the end, the truth about money, manipulation, and family loyalty proved more complex and challenging than any of us had imagined. But facing that complexity honestly, rather than hiding behind comfortable lies and financial subsidies, created opportunities for authentic relationships and genuine growth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Sometimes the most difficult path is also the most necessary one, especially when the people you love most are counting on you to have the courage to choose truth over comfort. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.